Whispers in the vault. That was how it began for me, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet recognition that something in the palace did not add up. I remember the moment an attendant confided her unease over a missing brooch, a diamond-and-sapphire piece linked to Princess Diana, logged meticulously for decades, yet suddenly absent. I studied the entry myself. The handwriting was neat, unchanged, declaring the jewel present as if the page had frozen time. But time had moved, and the jewel had slipped away. That small discovery marked the beginning of a storm that would test loyalty, reveal hidden motives, and threaten to stain the legacy of the late princess. I did not act hastily, for palace life trains one to respect discretion. Still, whispers grew louder. The disappearance of the brooch was followed by the absence of Diana's pearl drop earrings, remembered vividly from a charity gala in the mid-90s, and a bracelet gifted by a Middle Eastern royal family during a tour. Each missing item deepened the tension. These were not generic heirlooms lost in the shuffle of history. They were touchstones of a woman's public and private life, each linked to iconic photographs and emotional memory. I felt as if the palace itself was warning me through subtle gaps and silences that something more profound was at stake. When I raised the matter quietly with William, his reaction was immediate. His jaw tightened, his words grew clipped, and his anger was palpable. For him, Diana's jewels represented fragments of his mother's story, tangible evidence of a bond that death had not erased. To see them vanish into unmarked shadows was intolerable. My heart echoed his fury, but my mind urged caution. The palace is not only a home, it is a labyrinth of loyalties, traditions, and long corridors where every footstep is observed. To accuse without proof would risk destabilizing far more than a single relationship. As I began piecing together the anomalies, I turned to what outside observers often forget: the sheer professionalism of the staff. Attendants, archivists, curators. They are trained not just to serve, but to remember, to track the silent movement of artifacts that embody Britain's heritage. From them, I gathered fragments of testimony. Someone had seen unusual authorizations. Another had noticed items moved without the usual photographic logs. None dared to speak too loudly, but their hints formed a mosaic. The picture that emerged was troubling. The jewels were not simply misplaced, they had been deliberately extracted. Outside the palace walls, I found a wider context. International auction houses had long been criticized by watchdog groups for lapses in provenance checks. In 2013, for example, Transparency International reported how luxury assets often enter the market with opaque histories, their origins blurred by private collections and discreet dealers. Even Sotheby's and Christie's have faced calls to tighten protocols after questionable artifacts appeared in their catalogs. The royal jewels, if placed into such channels, could easily disappear under descriptions like "from a distinguished European collection." The more I considered this, the more it aligned with the anomalies I was witnessing. The whispers in the vault became my personal summons to act. I knew I could no longer treat the missing pieces as clerical oversights. They represented not only the memory of a beloved princess, but also the integrity of the monarchy itself. And the very fact that they were items linked to Diana made the matter politically volatile. The public's attachment to her image remained powerful decades after her death. To lose even a fraction of that legacy would be seen as betrayal. In quieter hours, I reflected on how these whispers paralleled other scandals of our time. The Panama Papers, revealed in 2016, showed how elites moved wealth through hidden accounts and shell companies exploiting opacity in global finance. Though different in scale, the principle was the same: when oversight is lax, trust erodes. In the monarchy, trust is not optional, it is the foundation upon which every ceremony, every public appearance rests. The absence of a brooch might seem minor, but in truth it threatened to crack the symbolic armor that shields the crown. I resolved then that silence was no longer acceptable. Each jewel missing was more than a loss of metal and stone. It was a wound in memory. Diana's jewels had been entrusted to us not merely as ornaments, but as vessels of history, as fragments of a woman who touched millions with her grace. The vault had whispered, and I had listened. The investigation would continue even if it led me into confrontation with those I had once considered beyond suspicion, catalogs and provenance gaps. Once the whispers in the vault could no longer be ignored, my eyes turned outward beyond the palace corridors. It was in the glossy pages of international auction catalogs where I first saw familiar outlines emerge. In Monaco, nestled among descriptions of rare gemstones and distinguished European pieces, there appeared a sapphire and diamond brooch that mirrored the one once clasped at Diana's jacket lapel. The catalog spoke in elegant vagueness, hinting at an illustrious past, but scrupulously avoiding any mention of its most famous wearer. The estimated price was staggering, but the absence of provenance was even louder than the numbers on the page. I stared at those photographs with disbelief, then a shiver of certainty. These jewels had not simply wandered, they had been steered into channels designed to obscure their origins. Auction houses thrive on discretion. Collectors prefer stories that flatter, not facts that invite scrutiny. And here, under the bright lights of Monaco, Diana's brooch was being rebranded as an anonymous treasure. To those who did not know, it was just another gemstone. To me, it was a fragment of memory stripped of its truth. The more I searched, the more unsettling confirmations followed. In Geneva, a pair of pearl drop earrings surfaced in another catalog, again listed as belonging to a private European collection. And in London, through whispers of dealers whose reputations rested on silence, I saw the delicate bracelet once placed on Diana's wrist by a Middle Eastern royal, offered quietly to select buyers. Each time the descriptions blurred history into fog, erasing the human story behind the jewels. It was not just theft, it was narrative theft, the stripping of identity from symbols that had belonged to someone irreplaceable. Outside evidence reinforced what I saw. In 2022, Reuters reported on how art and jewelry markets remained vulnerable to money laundering and illicit trade, despite international pledges to increase transparency. The Financial Action Task Force, FATF, has repeatedly warned that high-value luxury goods are prime vehicles for discreet transactions, with few questions asked of wealthy clients. Reading these reports while tracing Diana's jewels through catalogs, I felt a bitter recognition the royal legacy was being entangled in the very same networks used by oligarchs, smugglers, and shadowy financiers. I began contacting trusted associates. One, a woman deeply connected in Parisian charity circles, had casually mentioned seeing the brooch in Monaco, assuming it had been loaned for fundraising. Her casualness chilled me, for it showed how easily the deception worked. Without an explicit record, even the well-informed could mistake illicit sales for legitimate loans. Another associate quietly warned that once such items entered private collections in Geneva or Dubai, recovering them would require not only money, but diplomacy and leverage. These were not simply markets of wealth. They were fortified castles of secrecy. Yet the most haunting realization came when I considered public perception. Diana's image still carries unmatched resonance. To the British people, her memory is sacred, her story woven into collective history. If word spread that her jewels had been sold off like trinkets, the damage to the monarchy's moral authority would be incalculable. This was more than a family scandal. It was a constitutional risk. In an era where social media amplifies every whisper, even the hint of such betrayal could ripple into public outrage. BBC and The Guardian have both documented how minor missteps by the royal family ignite global headlines within hours. Imagine then the fury if Diana's jewels were confirmed to have been traded in discreet back rooms. I lingered on the pages of those catalogs, studying the photographs with the eye of someone searching for proof, not just for herself, but for history. The curve of the sapphire setting, the particular drop of the pearls, the delicate clasp of the bracelet, they were not generic designs, but unique signatures instantly recognizable to anyone who had followed Diana's life. And I had followed not as an outsider, but as someone entrusted with preserving the fragments left behind. Each discovery hardened my resolve. I clipped images, saved digital records, and compiled them into a dossier. But it was not enough to gather shadows. I needed to trace the hands that had placed them there. Auction catalogs reveal only the surface. Behind them lie networks of consignors, intermediaries, and appraisers. Someone had walked into those glittering halls with jewels that should have remained in the palace vaults. Someone had signed the paperwork that allowed them to be photographed under professional lights and offered to the highest bidder. The gap in provenance was not accidental. It was deliberate. And the fact that multiple pieces appeared within months of each other pointed to coordination, not chance. This was not the work of an opportunistic thief, but of a hand that wielded both authority and access. And as I gathered each page, each photograph, each whispered confirmation, one truth became harder to deny. The hand I sought was not in the shadows outside the palace, but within its very heart. Authorizations under the microscope. The glossy catalogs had given me images, but images alone could not unmask the hand behind the disappearances. To prove intent, I needed the cold weight of official paperwork, the dry ink of signatures that claimed authority. That search brought me to the Royal Archives, a labyrinth of ledgers and records that few ever see. Within its leather-bound volumes and sealed envelopes lies the machinery that sustains trust: who signed for what, when, and why. It was here among the pages that were never meant to leave dimly lit storerooms that I found the first undeniable traces. The records did not shout. They whispered, but in unmistakable tones. For each of the missing items, the sapphire brooch, the pearl drop earrings, the delicate bracelet, there appeared authorizations neatly entered, each stamped with dates and signed under the authority of Camilla. The handwriting was hers, as clear as though the ink had not yet dried. At first, I wanted to believe in clerical error, but the entries were too precise, too consistent. They framed the removals as official loans for events that never existed. Worse, there was no return record, no notation of the jewels finding their way back to the vaults. My heart sank as I studied those entries because this was no rumor, no speculation. It was evidence dressed as legitimacy. In the world of asset management, chain of custody is sacred. Banks require it for bullion, museums demand it for artifacts, and governments enforce it for archives. And yet here, in the very heart of the monarchy, that chain had been bent into a disguise for disappearance. I asked quietly for corroborating material. An archivist, hesitant but sympathetic, slid a slim envelope across the table. Inside were email confirmations between the palace jeweler and an external appraiser in Geneva. Each described valuations of pieces identical to those missing, appraisals requested days before the jewels appeared in auction catalogs abroad. I read them in silence, aware that my pulse quickened with every line. The appraiser's words were technical, but the implication was blunt. The jewels had been deliberately removed for valuation with no indication they would return. When I presented this to William, his anger was fierce but controlled. He had suspected betrayal, but now the paper spoke more clearly than gossip ever could. Camilla's signature on those lines was like a crack through the foundation of the family. He did not raise his voice, but his eyes blazed with the hurt of a son whose mother's legacy had been treated as currency. We agreed the matter could not yet be made public. Exposure without full preparation would risk scandal that might engulf us all. Outside the palace, the context made the revelation sharper. According to a 2021 BBC investigation, the art world remains one of the least regulated markets, with provenance checks often perfunctory and reliant on trust. Even the British Parliament has debated whether royal assets require stricter external oversight after controversies involving gifts and loans. Reading those reports in tandem with the records before me, I saw how the monarchy's closed traditions had become its weakness. The very secrecy meant to preserve dignity had opened a door for exploitation. I wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of me still resisted believing that Camilla herself would orchestrate such removals. Perhaps she had signed without scrutiny, trusting advisors who took advantage. Yet the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Multiple jewels, multiple signatures, each tied to subsequent appraisals abroad. Authority was not being borrowed, it was being wielded. In moments of solitude, I questioned my own motives. Was I seeking truth or vengeance for a woman whose absence had defined William's childhood, and by extension my own marriage? But each time I returned to the vaults, to the empty slots where jewels should rest, my resolve steadied. It was not about vengeance, it was about responsibility. To allow these authorizations to pass unchallenged would be to abandon the very idea of stewardship that the crown depends on. History offers cruel precedents. In the early 20th century, Russia's Romanov dynasty saw treasures vanish through corrupt courtiers long before revolution tore them down. In France, the Bourbon crown jewels were famously stolen in 1792 and scattered across Europe, weakening the monarchy's prestige. Each time, the loss of objects symbolized a deeper erosion of trust. I felt those echoes pressing in, reminding me that jewels are never just jewels. They are anchors of continuity, fragile yet essential. So I gathered the evidence, the signed authorizations, the Geneva emails, the photographs from catalogs. Piece by piece, I built a dossier whose weight could not be dismissed. And as the pages thickened, so too did my conviction. This was no misunderstanding, no administrative slip. It was a pattern orchestrated from within, with a hand both confident and careless in assuming no one would look. But I had looked, and what I saw could no longer be unseen. Following the money quietly. Paper trails of authorizations had opened the door, but to confirm intent, I needed to see where the jewel's disappearance converged with financial gain. In matters of illicit trade, money is the loudest witness, even when disguised under layers of secrecy. I began tracing payments not as a banker or prosecutor might, but as someone determined to connect personal betrayal with institutional risk. What I found was a pattern of anonymous transfers routed through shell companies and landing in accounts that whispered of proximity to Camilla's circle. The investigators I discreetly engaged explained how such schemes typically operate. A jewel appears at auction with murky provenance, purchased by a private collector using an offshore entity. The payment, often in the millions, flows into accounts in tax havens like the Cayman Islands or Luxembourg. From there, it is redistributed into trusts or holding companies that obscure the true beneficiary. The system thrives on opacity. Banks ask limited questions when dealing with clients shielded by wealth and connections. This was not speculation. It was precisely the type of financial maneuvering described in 2020 reports by the Financial Action Task Force, which warned that luxury assets remain highly vulnerable to laundering. I reviewed discreet files handed to me by a trusted palace investigator with intelligence experience. On 3 occasions, funds had been traced from buyers at Geneva and Monaco auctions into entities tied to a long-standing associate of Camilla. The sums were large enough to raise eyebrows, but small enough to avoid automatic reporting thresholds. The pattern was unmistakable. Assets left the vault appeared at auction, and soon after, deposits entered accounts linked to her inner circle. There was no direct line into her personal bank account, but proximity mattered. Influence leaves fingerprints even when names do not. The parallel with global scandals struck me forcefully. I recalled reading BBC coverage of the Pandora Papers, which exposed how elites worldwide hid billions in offshore trusts. The techniques were eerily familiar: layered ownership, nominee directors, and payments disguised as consultancy fees. Seeing Diana's jewels woven into similar patterns filled me with cold fury. This was no longer a question of misplaced heirlooms. It was evidence of the monarchy's heritage being fed into the same shadows as oligarch yachts and kleptocrat mansions. William listened grimly as I laid out the flowcharts. His silence was heavier than anger, a silence that seemed to carry his mother's memory in every beat. So they were turned into money. He finally said each word weighted. I nodded, because what else could I say? The jewels had been stripped not just of provenance, but of dignity, converted into transfers with no soul, no story. Yet I also saw the broader stakes. If such financial entanglements became public, the monarchy would face more than embarrassment. It would invite questions from regulators, from parliament, from journalists trained to detect hypocrisy. Public trust in the crown had always been fragile since Diana's passing. Linking her jewels to covert financial gain would detonate outrage across Britain and beyond. Already, polls documented by YouGov showed generational divides in support for the monarchy, with younger Britons more skeptical. A scandal of this magnitude could accelerate decline. I thought too of how financial scandals have shaped history. The abdication crisis of 1936 had less to do with Edward VIII's love for Wallis Simpson and more with fears of financial entanglement and political compromise. Monarchies fall not simply through political missteps, but through the corrosion of perceived integrity. And here before my eyes was corrosion in action, masked in ledgers and accounts. Despite the fury rising within me, I knew caution was essential. To expose too quickly without ironclad corroboration would risk claims of slander. The law is precise, and libel suits can destroy even legitimate accusations. So I continued gathering. I collected documents, testimonies, and expert analyses of how such transfers operate. I sought counsel from discreet financial analysts who had worked on high-profile money laundering cases. They confirmed the plausibility of what I had found. The pattern matched known laundering schemes. The deeper I went, the more my role blurred between investigator and custodian of history. I was no prosecutor, but I carried the responsibility of ensuring Diana's memory was not monetized in silence. Each bank transfer, each auction payment was not just a financial detail, it was a theft of legacy. Following the money was not glamorous. It meant nights hunched over spreadsheets, reviewing transaction codes, comparing dates. But each discovery strengthened the chain, turning suspicion into structure, whispers into argument. By the time my dossier thickened, it was clear jewels had been removed under false authorization, appraised abroad, sold discreetly, and monetized through financial webs tied to Camilla's circle. Motive, method, and opportunity converged. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was written in ink, in numbers, in signatures. And the weight of that evidence could not be ignored, no matter how deeply the palace preferred silence. The dossier and the fallout. By the time my dossier was complete, it had grown into a thick bundle of photographs, signatures, appraisal emails, and financial traces. I laid it out on William's desk one late evening, the lamplight glinting off the ink, as though the evidence itself demanded to be seen. He turned the pages in silence, his fingers tightening slightly with each new confirmation. It was not just information, it was betrayal, printed in black and white betrayal that carried the face of his mother in every missing jewel. We knew then that discretion had reached its limit. The monarchy survives by secrecy only when secrecy serves truth. When it serves lies, it corrodes from within. The question before us was no longer whether Camilla had signed or whether money had moved. The question was what to do with that knowledge and how to shield both Diana's memory and the monarchy's future from collapse. Approaching the king was inevitable. Charles had spent decades defending his relationship with Camilla against public criticism, and the decision to confront him carried immense risk. I remember the night vividly, the study's heavy curtains drawn, the grandfather clocks ticking, amplifying every second of silence. William spoke first, laying out the documents with a steadiness that masked fury. The signatures authorizing removals, the Geneva valuations, the auction catalogs, the financial trails leading into the orbit of her closest associates. Every page was a blade, and together they formed a sword too sharp to ignore. Camilla defended herself in calm tones, insisting the jewels had been moved for valuation or insurance purposes. She called the transactions misinterpretations, but the paper contradicted her, and her words avoided the core question: why had Diana's most personal treasures ended up in international sales rooms? Charles listened, his face drawn, with a conflict no monarch should bear, husband against sovereign, loyalty against duty. For me, the confrontation underscored a truth larger than the palace walls. Institutions falter, not when attacked from outside, but when compromised within. It reminded me of Deutsche Welle's reporting on corruption in Eastern Europe, how fragile democracies crumbled when insiders eroded trust. Here too, trust was dissolving, not in a parliament, but in a family whose survival rests on symbolism. And symbols had been stolen. The verdict came in hushed tones but firm resolution. Camilla would be removed from all oversight of royal assets, asked to vacate her Buckingham Palace quarters, her role reduced to ceremonial appearances at the king's discretion. The announcement to the public spoke only of restructuring responsibilities, but behind those words lay the reality of banishment. For decades she had fought to stand inside those walls, and now she was told to leave them behind. The fallout extended beyond rooms and titles. Whispers ran through staff corridors. Newspapers speculated with sharpened pens, and international outlets like Reuters and Al Jazeera began circling the story with cautious headlines about palace reorganization. They avoided naming jewels, but readers were quick to sense scandal. The monarchy had weathered storms before, yet this one was uniquely painful. It struck at Diana's memory, a sacred ground for millions. Privately, William and I focused on recovery. Quiet negotiations began with buyers in Geneva and Monaco, each approached discreetly to avoid headlines. Some, out of admiration for Diana, returned the pieces at cost, unwilling to profit from controversy. Others required delicate persuasion diplomacy couched in promises of anonymity. One by one, the brooch, the earrings, the bracelet returned to the vault, carried not in triumph, but in relief. When the three lay once again beneath the soft glow of security lights, William stood silently, his eyes fixed on them. They were not mere ornaments. They were fragments of his mother's life, fragments briefly stolen and now restored. Yet, restoration does not erase betrayal. The palace's air felt lighter after Camilla's departure, but it also carried scars. Trust once broken leaves cracks even when repaired. I realized then that my role had shifted. I was no longer just a witness to whispers in the vault. I had become a guardian of memory, forced to balance truth against optics, justice against survival. Looking forward, the lesson felt stark. Transparency is no longer optional for institutions bound by history. Whether in parliaments, corporations, or monarchies, the world demands accountability. The jewel's disappearance was not only about greed. It was about the assumption that legacy could be monetized without consequence. That assumption had been shattered, but at tremendous cost. As I closed the dossier for the final time, I felt no triumph. Only the sobering recognition that Diana's legacy had been tested, and the monarchy had been forced to choose preservation over denial. In the silence of the vault, the jewels gleamed as though they too knew they had been returned from exile. But their brightness carried a warning: never again allow shadows to guard the symbols of light.